Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be reviewing the 1983 series Agatha Christie's Partners in Crime and the accompanying film The Secret Adversary, starring James Warwick as Tommy and Francesca Annis. And let's start with an overview of the series. Technically, The Secret Adversary is a TV film, not really truly part of the Partners in Crime series. It was actually filmed after the miniseries was, but it aired a week before to lead into it, and it has the same cast and the same crew. And the series, it was not a big budget production, and I think that works in its favor. I'm of this opinion that in order to improve the quality of some of these Christie adaptations, I think the budget should be cut, not increased. I think having a smaller budget forces production to focus on the storytelling, and it makes the product a little more charming and a little better. Which is how I feel about this series. It's very charming, it's very campy, but it knows what it's doing. Like, none of these episodes are bad. At the same time, though, I don't think any of them are like truly top tier adaptations, which is why I think we could potentially see a better Tommy and Tuppence product down the road, but not a better Tommy and Tuppence themselves. And I do fear there isn't really an appetite for us to make more of these. I mean, Tommy and Tuppence are, less well known than Poirot and Marple. And a lot of the more recent adaptations, are also standalones. But, especially since the Tommy and Tuppence sort of recent adaptations there, which was also called Partners in Crime, it flopped. But that's not the fault of the original works. That's the fault of the production. And because, the Beresfords age over time, I think that makes doing a series difficult. There's also only four novels, one of which is like completely incomprehensible. And I don't feel as if there's an appetite to adapt short stories anymore. There's actually not been an adaptation of a Christie short story since 2016, and that was the French Le Petit Mort version of The Adventure of Johnny Waverley. So I think this series remains the gold standard and is going to remain the gold standard for a while still. But, it's a lot of fun. It's not serious, but it's also, I don't know, that Tommy and Tuppence are a bit comedic here, but, not overly so. I think there's so much fun chemistry between James Warwick and Francesca Annis, and yeah, it can get cheesy at times, but it really contributes to the charmingness of the series. And all of their zany adventures are still there. The episodes for the short stories, mostly remove references to other mystery authors, mostly because they're forgotten by 1983. But the Beresfords usually engage in the same behavior. They do the same things. There's just not the reference to those previous detectives is not explicitly mentioned all the time. They also did not adapt the Man Who Was Number 16 story. That's the one with all like the Russian spy stuff that sort of like appears here and there throughout in between stories and all that. I mean, it just makes sense why they would skip that. But weirdly, they did keep like the farce of Tommy pretending to be Mr. Blunt and Tuppence being his secretary, which is like I don't know why they did that when they did away with like the Russian stuff. And also it feels at times like they seemingly forgot they were doing this still. But anyway, we also have Reece Dinsdale as Albert, who was fantastic, and he very much plays up like the fantasy of being a PI and also like the proper butler. And he's just as cheesy and over the top as his employers. His love of action movies is a constant source of annoyance to Tommy. There's also Arthur Cox, who plays Inspector Marriott, who is from the short stories and sort of like sets Tommy up at the detective agency. Again, he's not really that big a part. And overall, these are very faithful adaptations to the story. Sometimes they did play around here and there because they had to fill out the hour, but again, mostly very faithful. And let's start off by talking about The Secret Adversary, which was film length and was sort of an introduction to the series. It's extremely accurate to the original novel. All of these like 1980s adaptations were very accurate because, Christie had died in 1976 and her daughter was very hesitant to sell the film rights to her mother's works because her mother hated most of the adaptations in her lifetime. And like the BBC and ITV, which ITV is the one who produced this series, and these other firms had to prove they would be faithful in order to get more rights out of Rosalind Hicks. And I think The Secret Adversary is sort of the best of these standalones, in air quotes, that we got in the 80s. I think with the likes of, like, Why Didn't They Ask Evans and The Seven Dials Mystery, both starring James Warwick, the loyalness to the book, I think, was a bit too much, whereas here it worked a lot better. And I think that's mostly because of Secret Adversary is just a better book, but it still worked. And the action can be slow because the film is doing everything the book is doing, whereas on screen, I do feel like maybe things could have been streamlined a little bit. Some things could have been dispensed with here and there just to make the action a little more heavier. I actually think this is the best adaptation of any Tommy and Tuppence work. To be fair, I haven't seen all of the foreign language ones yet. I really don't have a ton of notes on this one. I did find the actor who played Julius Hersheimer to be a bit grating, and he was over the top in sort of like an uncharming way. Not in the same way Tommy and Tuppence are, but I think he's supposed to be doing that. It's intentional. It's very much the parody of the rich American. And we also have Honor Blackman, who, James Bond's Pussy Galore. She was fantastic in this, as she played Mrs. Vandermeyer. And I think overall, this is a great adaptation. I think it could have been better, but it's still very nostalgic to me and very charming in a good way. It was a very enjoyable film. The first episode of the Partners in Crime series is The Affair of the Pink Pearl. Technically, the first third of this episode is also the Fairing the Flat short story slash A Pot of Tea. That's the introductory story from the collection, and they adapt it here, and it makes sense to combine these two. I mean, the Fairing the Flat is the one where Tuppence tricked the man into using the blunt detective agency because business is slow, but the last 2/3 are dedicated to the Affair of the Pink Pearl, and Tommy and Tuppence's, or should I say, Mr. Blunt and Miss Robinson's first case. And this is a great introduction to Tommy and Tuppence. I know we did have The Secret Adversary. This is sort of another introduction. But, this episode really sets the tone and the characters for the rest of the series. It's appropriately goofy, but very faithful to the original short stories. And I would say they play up the zaniness a bit more here, but I mean, these were always stories that were meant to be more fun rather than superb quality. And I've always had a soft spot for Tommy and Tuppence. And I have to say, the acting from the one-time characters in this episode was particularly bad. But it was bad in sort of like a enjoyable way. It's one of those ones where you can tell they're acting, but, that all works for this series, which is meant to be fun. And it must be intentional because there's some big name performers here. It's not like these are no names. I mean, this episode had Dulcie Gray and Linda LaPlante, both of whom are crime writers as well. It's also the very first acting role on screen for Charles Shaughnessy, who you may all know better as Mr. Sheffield on The Nanny. But I did think the clues leading to the culprit here were very obviously laid in there. And to be fair, that is the case in the short story too, but it works better in the short story. But this was a remarkably faithful adaptation. I think having an hour episode, really helps because these are a bit shorter and allowed the characters to come to life. There's a lot made of Tuppence's hat still, which is a very nice little character moment from the original where she's spending all of their money on these expensive hats that she says are quite glamorous and Tommy likes as well. I have to be honest, I thought the hats were very ugly, but again, this is 1920s fashion, so I guess, my opinion doesn't matter on that. The second episode was The House of Lurking Death, and I thought this was a pretty solid episode. This is one of where a few people get poisoned by a box of chocolates sent through the mail, and then later died from poisoned fig paste, and you all know how much I love a good poisoning through a chocolate box in the mail mystery. And I found this episode appropriately spooky while also keeping up the mystery and the sort of lightheartedness of a Tommy and Tuppence short story. This one is a lot easier to take seriously than the Pink Pearl, although it does have its moments. I mean, the actress playing the overly religious maid Hannah is just extremely over the top, and that is what production is going for, but the climactic scene at the end is just really ridiculous, and spoiler alert here for this episode, but if you watch closely, you can actually see the actress who plays Miss Logan blink when she's supposed to be dead, so there are little tiny issues here and there. but this is one of the ones that actually fills out the entire 60-minute episodes. Some of these down the line do have issues in like stretching the plot out for the whole hour, but this one doesn't, and I very much enjoyed this episode as well. The next episode is the Sunningale Mystery, and this one to me had its ups and downs. I mean, this is one where Tommy and Tuppence investigate a murder of Captain Cecil on a golf course. The Sunningale golf course is a real golf course. Archie Christie golfed there and did some other things there. And, slight spoiler here, but this mystery involves an impersonation, which I felt the show handled very well. I mean, these impersonation tricks are very difficult to pull off on screen because you have to decide how much of the person in question you actually show and how much you can hide that person without it becoming too obvious what's going on. And I thought this episode did a very good job with that. I also thought it did a good job in the setup where Tommy and Tuppence, really Tommy, plays the part of the old man in the corner from Baroness Ortsky. And as I said, those detective tributes are mostly not mentioned but are present. Again, this one is one that's not mentioned. But on the flip side, this episode is kind of boring. Like, the mystery isn't boring, but this one has just, like, a lot of flashbacks that are pretty lengthy, and Tommy and Tuppence don't really do a whole lot. I mean, these episodes are super faithful to the short story collection, but I think this is a case where maybe they could have made some changes to make it more interesting, like have Tommy and Tuppence do more. This isn't necessarily a short story that adapted well as is, but again, I thought it was a good job otherwise. The next episode was The Clergy Men's Daughter, and this is one that's a bit of a ghost story. Only of course it's not a real ghost. And this is an adaptation of The Clergy Men's Daughter, obviously, but also The Red House. This was one of those ones that was split into two parts. And I really liked this adaptation. There was a lot of Albert in this one. And sometimes Albert did get a bit sidelined, unfortunately. And I actually found this one to have been a bit restrained in the acting while still having the zaniness of Tommy and Tuppence. I thought the series really portrayed the spooky ghost story atmosphere very well. It felt very Hitchcocky in that it wasn't scary, but it was eerie and suspenseful, and consistently so. It also did maintain the kooky Tommy and Tuppence moments without feeling disjointed between the two. This is a bit of a change in order of the events that happened from the short story. It's a little different, but it's not that big of a deal. And there's also a treasure hunt one, which was a lot of fun. I felt this one was much more grounded and not as over the top as many of the other episodes. And like I said, I don't mind the goofiness of these, but it was nice to see it toned down for this particular episode. The next episode is Finessing the King, which is an adaptation of another one of those short stories that was split in two. The other half is The Gentleman Dressed in Newspaper. And this was another very good one. It is largely faithful to the original story, and the plot isn't expanded upon, but instead of being told things, we actually see them, which is very nice. And this is obviously to stretch out the time, but it was still nice not to be told a bunch of things as could happen in the series. And I thought the party scene was very well done. I mean, Tommy and Tuppence were having just an absolute ball there, and Tuppence wears a number of hats, and I found them particularly ugly, uglier than usual. And they looked like leather motorcycle caps to me. And I had a good time watching this episode. Again, it had been a while since I watched this series, and I did think watching this episode exposed a few minor instances of the plot not working correctly. I think this is unique to the episode and not to the short story, and it does get a bit spoilery here, but I'll do my best to avoid spoilers. But our victim is murdered by someone in costume, and she mistakes who this person is, yet she just kissed him, which would make me think, does she not know who she was kissing in that costume? This is something we see as Tuppence explains what happens, and it seemed to be a bit of an oversight from production because we don't know what actually happened in Christie's story at that point. It's not really a big deal, but just something, a little tiny knock there. The next episode was The Ambassador's Boots, and this was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I think this had a lot of fun moments, especially with Albert learning how to lasso and him taking his date to see the same Western movie over and over and over again. And I thought the beauty salon scene was pretty good, and the mystery was largely faithful to the original. However, this story is simply not long enough to fill out a 50 to 60 minute episode, and the show had to add in a bunch of new plot points and events. And while these things weren't the worst, it very much felt like they were added to stretch out the episode because the material just wasn't there. There's a whole new subplot about drug drug smuggling that was very unoriginal and was something I've seen like a million times before, and it added nothing to the episode. It felt very disjointed from the actual plot that was going on. And again, it wasn't bad necessarily, it just wasn't the greatest either. I think this is the weakest episode in the series. And the next episode was The Man in the Mist, which I always thought was a very fun, both story and episode. The plot is expanded to fit the 50 minutes, but it's expanded in a way that makes sense, and it fills out the plot. It expands on character as well, so it doesn't feel obviously stretched out just to fill in the time slot. And I really enjoyed the expansion of the Bulger character here. This felt a little bit more like a whodunit than the short story did. The short story is more of a ghost story than a whodunit, and I would say the episode is probably equal parts whodunit and ghost story. I thought the case here was very good. This is actually one of the more serious episodes, and it was nice to see this sort of tone from Tommy and Tuppence, proving that James Warwick and Francesca Annis can do the dramatic seriously when they want to. I do think it was a shame there was no Albert in this episode. I'm a pretty big Albert fan. And my biggest pet peeve with the episode was the titular mist looked very phony at times, but that's such a minor issue for this episode. And also, the short story has this problem where it's very easy to forget that Tommy is dressed as a priest. But when you have a screen adaptation, it's much easier to remember. So I actually think that works in the adaptation's favor. And this episode does maintain the Father Brown references from the text, Father Brown being one of the few tributes from the short story collection that was still known to most people in the 1980s, which is why I suspect they kept it in there. And there had just been a Father Brown adaptation in the 70s, I believe it was. But, I did think this was a very good episode. This is actually one of the strongest episodes in the series for me. The next episode was The Unbreakable Alibi, which is a fun little story. I don't particularly care for this episode, sadly, and to be fair, it is mostly faithful to the original story, but because the story isn't complex enough to sustain a 50-minute episode, we do get the whole bit of Tommy and Tuppence investigating both of Una Drake's alibis, and that does take up the bulk of the episode, but the episode is padded out with this very, shoehorned subplot about stolen paintings that ends in someone's death. It feels very out of place and drastically changes the tone of the story from what it should be. I did not like this new content, and to be honest, I don't think it was necessary because there are things cut from the original text they could have used instead. I mean, granted, those are all just a bunch of interviews that we don't really need, and I think production probably thought even more interviews would be boring. And the story lacked a bit of action, so they wanted to insert that in. But also, the ending is changed here, and I definitely prefer the original ending that Christie wrote and not this one. It does change the story a little too much and not for the better, but I still think this episode was fun. It was very good when it was adapted the content from the short story, but the original stuff left a lot to be desired. And while I think The Ambassador's Boots is the weakest episode in the series because there's just not a lot going on there, I do think there's the choice that this one is actually worse in quality. The penultimate episode is The Case of the Missing Lady, and this is another one that the original short story just simply did not have enough content for 50 minutes. The beginning part is largely faithful, although they took out all the Sherlock Holmes references, which is weird because they actually did insert them in Finessing the King. But I have to say, this time I did like the new content for the most part. It didn't feel added for length, although some of the plot did change. But this episode was a lot of fun and totally ridiculous in a good way. It might be zanier than the original, actually. The ending, which is different from the short story, is just so ridiculous. It's actually even too ridiculous for the series, but it's so bizarre, involves a rather silly chase scene. But again, it's still enjoyable because James Warwick and Francesca Annis, make it happen. And my largest criticism here is that there's a sequence where Tuppence is impersonating this Russian ballerina, and she's distracting everyone by telling stories so Tommy can break into the hospital. That goes on for way too long. It's just Tuppence telling the story of Swan Lake, and Francesca Annis is very good at this, and it's very funny, but it lasts way too long, and we barely ever cut to Tommy breaking in, which is the whole point of this scene. It takes up nearly 10 minutes of the episode and wears thin awfully fast, but overall, I did enjoy this episode quite a bit. The actor who played played Gabrielle Stavinson was so perfect for this role. The actor is Jonathan Newth, who has appeared in pretty much all of the, regular British mystery series, including the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes. He was also Dr. Granger in the Suchet Dumb Witness. The series was very good at casting even the smaller roles to match the characters just right, and I thought that was on display here. And the final episode is The Crackler, which was mostly faithful to the original. And when it wasn't, I enjoyed the new subplot, mostly because it involved Albert, and it gave him a much larger role. He was criminally underutilized in this series. I wouldn't even mind like a whole spin off of Albert, to be honest. But this episode went very heavy on like the lovey-dovey stuff between Tommy and Tuppence. It got a really cheesy at points. Like you're gagging yourself at how much they love each other. I give this episode a lot of credit for the setting. It very much felt like the 1920s. All of these episodes did, but this one felt the most like 20-ish, 1920s, I should say. However, there's a bit of a goof here, and when discussing their mystery novels for their bookshelf, Tommy mentions having Rex Stout novels. Rex Stout did not start writing Nero Wolfe until 1934. Technically, yes, I know there are other Rex Stout novels at the time, but only one was a mystery, and it's very clear Tommy was talking about Nero Wolfe. But the Beresfords do mention Edgar Wallace here, with this being one of the few mystery novelists that does get mentioned. A little surprising to me because I didn't think Edgar Wallace was all that well known in the 1980s. I guess he's probably larger then than he is now. But, this episode actually makes quite a bit of fun of Edgar Wallace. There's a lot of, inside jokes you probably didn't notice, and I'm sure no one noticed but me. But at times, I did find this episode a little boring. For a story about gambling and counterfeiting, I did think it could have used more action. But overall, it was a very faithful and strong episode. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Partners in Crime and The Secret Adversary and James Warwick and Francesca Annis, who to me, again, they're the gold standard for Tommy and Tuppence, at least at this point. I suspect they always will be. Next week, we're starting a little bit of a summer vacation through mystery novels. Again, like I did last year, only this year there wasn't too many travel novels, celebrating milestone anniversaries. But next week we'll be going on vacation with Albert Campion, as he sort of goes on vacation. He's on leave from World War II temporarily and actually returns home. So again, I don't know if that's a vacation or not, but it's what we're going with here. And what is personally my favorite Campion novel, Coroner's Pigeon, celebrating its 80th anniversary in 2025. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.